All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I guess that should go in there too. It's usually how we start off these weekly videos. So I hope everything's going well for you. This week and next week, we're going to move into talking about advertising, some great articles, podcast information, videos on advertising history, development, and sort of its impact on us is sort of the idea. Advertising is, it's everywhere. I mean, literally, it's everywhere, right? It's hard to go somewhere and not to be in commercial space. Um, and what I think is not often known or we don't think about is it hasn't always been this way. Not every culture does it this way. And there's a link between, of course, advertising, consumption, mass consumption. So there's sort of an environmental component going on here. There's a component to economic development. So you start thinking about capitalism and very particular forms of capitalism as far as regulations of capital, with the United States being an outlier in some sort of ways where we have more of a free market approach. So we have a hard time engaging in discussions about regulating the market, or there's a lot of opposition to doing that. I'll just give you one quick example while I'm thinking about it, or two. One in Chile, becoming more involved in the global food network system. They're having more import of and use of high sugar, high fat diet, things like this, and they're having a problem. This is true of Central America and a lot of South American countries of increased childhood obesity. So the Chilean government a few years ago, may have been last year, a few years ago, passed legislation that prohibited companies from using mascots to advertise sugary cereals and other forms of food to kids. And that they just see it as a public health viewpoint, right? It's public health. They're trying to figure out how do we deal with this epidemic of childhood obesity, and this is sort of one of many approaches to do that. That would just be so difficult to pass here in the United States. We have some, because of the sort of idea about the free market and not regulating the market. I mean, we do regulate some things like tobacco, right? So I think it could make the case for regulating sort of advertising and food, but there'd be so much opposition, and it goes against a lot of our core values. But I think those values represent interest. It sort of becomes the tension. Does it represent the interest of the collective, or is it about sort of the common interest of all of us? And then sort of another example, you looked at direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceutical medications. If you are under the age of 30, I would say, you probably don't know of a world where pharmaceutical advertisements were not part of your everyday environment. So you watch TV, you look through advertising, so you look for magazines, you look online. Pharmaceutical advertisements are prominently placed. And that wasn't until mid-1990s. 1996 was legislation, I think in 1997, allowed for direct-to-consumer advertising. United States and New Zealand are the only two countries in the world that allow for direct-to-consumer advertising on television, just sort of mass media outlets. And that tells you something, right? I mean, it's like a lot of countries don't see that as in the public interest. They see that as in the interest of corporations, not in the public interest. So part of this chapter in this section, I want to kind of shake things up a little bit. Not shake things up for the intent of shaking things up, but to provide information, perspective, to gather positions, so to be able to better understand sort of this area of life that we are, we're immersed in, that we see oftentimes. So this is sort of an investigation of advertising. Okay, so one of the articles this week, or there's a couple chapters from a book called The Father of Spin. And it's really about a person by the name of Edward Bernays, a cousin of Sigmund Freud, nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he's identified as the father of public relations. And it's he wrote a few books. I mean, he called one of his books that he wrote was called Propaganda. I mean, he called it for what it was, right? It's about how to encourage people to do things, how to convince them, and what tools and techniques to be able to do that. And so that's kind of early on, right? It's propaganda. I mean, in some ways you can think about advertising as propaganda. There's sort of, maybe you can see it as two ends of continuum. advertising is providing information about a product, and then the other side is that advertising is really about propaganda. It's about moving beliefs and values and ideas that are trying to convince people of something they need to be convinced about. Because the only way you're going to buy a product, I mean, if one way to think about advertising, the role of advertising must create a need, right? You must establish that a person is missing something. So it has to create dissatisfaction in order to create, like, this product becomes a solution for that satisfaction. So think about that for a second. Think about the areas of our bodies, the areas of our lives that get constructed to have negative meaning or critical meaning, for us to start to view that maybe we are incomplete as we are, and that we need to have certain products to be able to improve upon ourselves to make us better. Remember last week looking at white teeth and white teeth strips? I mean, great example. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, white teeth, not nearly to the degree of prominence as today. I mean, it's a whole area of marketing and development worldwide. And Americans have a fascination with, just straight white teeth. And that's not a global phenomenon. And of course, in less developed countries, I mean, that's not even an option, right? It's like, so there's a lot of cultural things going on there. There's a lot of stuff that's happening. But think about the power of that to create, if you understand, social psychology, the looking glass self and Charles Cooley, you just sort of get the idea that if we keep on holding up pictures like this is what the ideal type of this kind of person looks like, and it's white teeth, it's straight white teeth. After a while, I mean, you may say, well, it doesn't really matter to me, but you have to contend with that image that becomes a dominant image about who you should be or what your presentation of self should be. I mean, it's powerful. I mean, that's part of the reason I think this section is particularly interesting, because it has, we can see the connection from the macro level, from institution and culture, all the way down to the micro level, the individual and the groups, and its impact. So yeah, in the couple chapters from The Father of Spin, it's really about giving you some examples and illustrations and historical development about advertising. You're not going to get a lot of information. I mean, there's so many great resources out there. I wish we could have a whole class on just advertising, but unfortunately, we're just going to get bits and pieces here and there, which is sufficient for us. The idea is to kind of gain that historical perspective, pull back some layers on advertising, and become a little bit more informed and a little bit more appropriately critical of the industry. And so, I guess one other thing to include that you're not going to probably get in the book too much is, or those chapters from the book, is that early advertising. We're going to go back to the 1800s. I mean, you can go back earlier than that, but let's go back to go to the 1800s. Late 1800s, all the way to the early 1900s, it was just information. There may have been an image, but it wasn't an image that was trying to appeal to people. So if it was, for a shirt, it was the picture of a shirt. It wasn't like a particular model, a particular dress appearance, a particular way of presenting that shirt. It was the shirt and then a description of what it was. It was text rich. Some advertisements going back, I mean, it was almost all text, right? And it wasn't until, about the time period of Bernays where we start, the recognition starts to become one of, oh, we can do more with advertising. It's not about, we have to differentiate ourselves between different products. So there's a story of economic development in here you're not going to get from the books too, is that, once we industrialization and we figure out product development in different ways, and we're producing things at a quicker rate, production speeds up, and we're moving goods faster and further. Companies have to start to compete against, or there's more companies competing for business. So they have to differentiate themselves. It can't just be text anymore. They have to say how they're better than their opposition or for another product. And then we start getting into all kinds of different things with advertising, where it starts to move to a little bit less text rich and about promises of what the product will do for you. So it becomes a little bit more of that propaganda that Bernays is kind of getting into. And then really in the 1950s with TV is really where it sort of takes this unique another form, and that's very visual, right? Sort of visual, kind of a visual component to advertising. That's the first of its time. And now it becomes more, starts to move into lifestyle more. And it was a time period of the ER words, like quicker, faster, speedier, These kind of, this is like what it can do, and it was sort of the the time of the ER words in advertising. And really with cable television, I'd say like 1980s and on, we get into what's called emotional branding, lifestyle branding, right? And so it's like this is sort of the world that we're into today, is we're buying products. The products may be fairly similar, and they're all good quality. They're good enough, I mean, most of them. So we're buying identities. And this is what you're going to get next week, and we're going to focus more on the issue of identity. When we're buying something, we're buying more than just the product. We're buying something, we're buying the lifestyle, a representation of a lifestyle, and these kind of things. Okay, so that's just a little bit of historical background and perspective I want you to think about. So the question for this week, actually one more thing before we get there, is in the Father's Spin. So after the couple chapters of Father's Spin, there is an article on Listerine, a real short one. Yeah, read that. It's a good example. It's a great example. The Marlboro Man. It's not required reading. It's a real short write-up, though. It's another great example about creating a need and image-based sort of marketing. What I want you to do for your question this week in your write-up is for you to look around on the internet, just sort of type in a particular product, let's say a particular Coors Light, a big mass distributor of beer, Budweiser. Look for, big companies, products, or, if you don't want to do that, maybe smaller. I guess it doesn't really matter if it's a big company, small company. But type in that in a search engine, and then click on images, and then just look at a series of advertisements. And what I'd like you to do, and you can do this for, alcohol, you could do it for food products, you could do it for clothing, you could do it for shoes, you could do it for, for vacations, whatever it might be, but it's got to be a specific company and a specific product. And what you do is to look over a bunch of images, and then I want you to analyze them. What do you notice? What are they representing? What patterns do you see in terms of representation? What is the setting? Who are the models? Race, class, gender, these different kind of things. What are the appeals they're making? So how are they appealing to the potential consumer? What needs are they trying to generate? The need for something so that people will buy it. And then how do you see maybe the propaganda? What is sort of going on here in terms of how people are being persuaded? What are the techniques of persuasion to try to get people to buy this particular product? And then maybe I already touched it on already, but I'll just reiterate it, is representation. So if we're looking at who are the models or who's presenting the product, what do you notice in terms of representation? Who's included and who's omitted? You could look at age, disability status, race, class, gender, other boundaries as well, and I think that becomes sort of an important part. So then I want you to just kind of analyze that. So those are, things to think about. So what do you notice as you look through those advertisements? What's sort of your perspective about those? So that's the write-up for this week. So you have the articles on the Father's Spin, the write-up for that. And then, you have the sort of the question write-up, the weekly question. That always goes first. Put the weekly question response first, then the Father's Spin. And then as a separate document, you have the podcast, which is a Hidden Brain PBS podcast on consumption. It's fascinating, interesting. I hope you find this content, half as exciting as I do. I think it's such a great, cool area. And I think it's so important. I remember talking to our kids, a while ago. This is probably 5 years ago when they're in high school. Asked them if they had a media studies class in high school, and our oldest said, "Yeah, we have it." And it's he told me about the content of the class, and I was so disappointed because the class seemed to be taught by someone who it was just sort of an extra on their workload. And it was more just a study hall more than anything else. And to me, one of the most important classes, and I've had students, in my face-to-face class, we talk about this class, and they go, "Man, it's such an amazing class, a great class, and one that's really helping to understand the self and understand community and society, and that critical media studies is just such an important, valuable part of an education." And I hope you find that as well. So hope you enjoy the readings. If you have other ones for this content or any future content, or you have videos you'd like to share, content, let me know. Articles, whatever it may be. I always appreciate that. Have a great week, and we'll stay in touch.